Imagine wearing a metal muzzle, not as a disguise, not as protection, but as punishment, a device that was strapped to the head with a rod jammed into the mouth to keep it shut. You are unable to speak. You are unable to swallow. You can barely swallow. Saliva runs freely down the chin. The pain is continuous, in your cheeks, in your jaw, and in your pride. This occurred. This was history. Human muzzles were not instruments of fiction or metaphor. They were used, barefaced, across Europe and the Americas, on the slaves, on women, on the powerless. This is the startling story of human muzzles, how and why they were employed, what they represented, and what they reveal regarding the worst of power. A human muzzle was effectively an appliance with a single function: to muffle someone. That doesn't even begin to convey the sadism of its design. Typical of iron or steel, a man's muzzle consisted of bands around the head and chin, even the face, in a sophisticated cage-like arrangement. The most fearsome and ghastly feature was the metal bit or plate rammed into the mouth of the wearer. This either forced the tongue down, forced the jaws as far apart as possible, or silenced any type of vocalization at all. Others included spikes that pierced the tongue whenever the individual attempted to move the tongue. On others, the entire headgear was locked into place and could only be taken out by the individual who had put it in. These instructions were not uniform. They were constructed to great deviation, some for temporary ad hoc application and others for the specific purpose of prolonged agony. They were all founded on the same precept: control by enforced quiet. Human muzzles varied over space and time, and typically took forms responsive to contemporary cultural or political trends. In 16th and 17th century England and Scotland, the most common expression was the scold's bridle, an English innovation that was usually used against female scolds, that is, women who spoke too much, too often, or too forcefully for their sex. Silence was a virtue, or women's anyway, in those societies. Such scolds were a disturbance to domestic peace, religious decency, or civic tranquility. The bridle was one of the public and agonizing methods of subordinating an individual to obedience. At the same time, during the 18th and 19th centuries, when the transatlantic slave trade was most fervent, an identical implement was used on slaves in the Americas. They were also referred to as iron bits or slave muzzles. Slave masters used them mainly to discipline slave insurgents, disobedient slaves, those attempting to escape, or those speaking their native languages. Some were used even to punish slaves for eating dirt or indeterminate things. Substance, an act of desperation more likely to be associated with religious protest or suicide, whether on a European town square, southern plantation. The device was not only to punish, but to make an example and enforce silence, literally and symbolically. Let's reveal a little closer. A scold's bridle was a standard one fashioned in iron, strapped tightly around the head and tied in the back or under the chin. Hitched to it was a flat iron gag, the bridle bit, put in the mouth. It was laid on top of or pushed against the tongue. They came with pointed tips or spikes on them that bled whenever the tongue brushed against them. They also had bells or horns on the top to attract public attention as a supplement to injury brought about by bodily suffering. Slave muzzles were less sophisticated and more crude in design. Iron collars were about solid faceplates or about horizontal bars driven into the mouth. They hindered breathing and made it effectively impossible. The metal became hot in the sun and left burns. It clung to the skin when cold. They were worn for hours or days, depending on the severity of the case. The longer, the more likely the chance of infection, asphyxiation, or facial injury. These muzzles, however, were not made for humane use. They were made to humiliate and dominate. So who wore human muzzles, and why? In early modern Europe, the bridle was almost exclusively used on women. Accusations could range from gossiping to criticizing local officials or simply arguing with one's husband. The punishment reinforced patriarchal values that women should be silent, obedient, and submissive. In this context, the muzzle was both a weapon and a warning. Step outside your role, and you'll be publicly silenced. For enslaved people in the Americas, the muzzle was an instrument of racial terror. Slaves were not merely laborers, they were property. Speech, song, prayer, and language were potential spaces of subversion. Silencing these voices was silencing rebellion. Slave owners used muzzles to correct the obstinate among them, but also to break spirits, suppress identity, and destroy culture. In either case, the muzzle was not a matter of words, but of ruling the power to speak at all. Physical discomfort from wearing a muzzle was genuine, but psychological damage was just as deep. Where a human muzzle made the person wearing it the center of attention, but not in a positive way. In villages, they were escorted down streets, taunted, or shunned. On plantations, they were discarded in fields or backyards, drooling, speechless, and humiliated. They were a spectacle, not human, but a threat. This humiliation was deliberate. It was a warning to others. You could be next. It also continued to perpetuate the belief that speech, perhaps the most basic human utterance, was something to be snatched away on a whim by the powers that be. And even when finally taken away, damage so frequently lingered. Pain, scarring, and jaw disability were common. But the wounds that cut deeper could not be observed. Shame, fear, silence. Human muzzling is old-fashioned, but its warning holds true now. They remind us of the ways silence has been leveraged as a means of oppression against women, against slaves, against anyone who's ever been deemed disruptive. They remind us how systems of control have always feared one thing above all others: a voice. And those voices continue to ring out. Enslaved people had transmitted music, stories, and acts of defiance. Women continued to speak, write, protest, and take up space. Muzzle didn't succeed in its ultimate goal because memory, truth, and history can't be muzzled forever. Iron bits and scolds bridles don't work today. Their ghosts remain, however, in shows that still silence the marginalized, mock dissent, and shame speech. The contrast now. We can tell the tale, we can talk, and listen, openly. Thank you for joining me as I worked through this spooky chapter in our history. If it taught you something, pass it along. Because the louder we yell, the harder it gets to remain silent about the facts.